in my opinion, not that it matters all that much, religious liberty being the grandest feature of the American experiment. In years past, as you may recall, on Religious Sunday, Religious Liberty Sunday, we have explored the stories of famous figures such as Isaac Backus and John Leland and his influence on James Madison and making sure that the Virginia Charter had a religious liberty clause within it, and even how the founder of our own little community was jailed back in Virginia for daring to preach in the Baptist way instead of cowering to those who had their own particular religious expression. And how he and his brother found themselves in a jail cell in Virginia and decided maybe we ought to cross the mountains in pursuit of religious freedom. Today's scripture text is found in John chapter 8. In this wonderful passage, as Jesus is teaching and begins to interact with some people who have questions about his faith and their faith and how they might coexist. This passage is one of the central texts for a healthy understanding of religious freedom. Jesus is dealing with a certain group of religious leaders, and they are struggling with some of his ideas in this text. They are wondering how it is that they might reframe their understanding of their own uniqueness in relation to what Jesus is saying. Would you look with me there in John chapter 8, beginning at verse 31, and I'll read verses 31 through 36. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham, and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." These people with whom Jesus is speaking have a notion in their minds. It is deeply set within their households and within their faith tradition that is passed down from one generation to the next. And that idea is that they are unique due to their ethnic heritage. They are unique because they come from Abraham. And because Abraham was the heir to the promise and passed the promise from one generation to the next, and because they can trace their lineage back to Abraham, they are children of the promise and are free in their own minds. And so they're struggling as Jesus starts talking about setting them free. Why would we need this? What in the world are you saying about our freedom and about our family and about our heritage? And how can freedom be dependent upon anything else than what we've understood freedom to be? They're reacting to a sort of perceived implication that other people besides themselves might be free in some other ways, and they themselves might not be free. It's troublesome. It's problematic. It's upsetting. It's polemical. It's difficult for them to grasp. So Jesus tells a story. Or he paints a picture. He gives them an image, one they could relate to and one that most of us can relate to. Jesus says it's like a household. It's like a family. And he's talking about a family as it would have existed in the ancient Roman world, because first century Palestine was part of the ancient Roman world. He's talking about a family structure that would have had the immediate family, moms and dads and sons and daughters, but it also might have had siblings, and it probably would have had elders living there, and it probably would have also had household servants. And just so we don't clean it up too much and gloss over it, they probably would have had slaves as well. It might have still been difficult for Jesus' listeners to hear themselves in a story in which they play the slave role. But at least they can understand his starting point. They can understand the image of a household, of a family. Jesus says in a household, in a family, it's not about who sins and who does not sin, because we've all spilled the peas, or we've all spilled the milk, or we've all made some sort of grievance toward the rest of the family. In a household, all have sinned. We know what it is to be a part of a household where we share space and we bump into each other and we upset one another from time to time. It's not about who does and who does not sin. It's about getting invited to join the family. Because within the ancient Roman household, a slave never has an opportunity to earn his way into the family. A slave never has an opportunity to buy himself out and earn entrance into the family. The only way a slave might gain admission into the inner circle of the household is by invitation only. For example, the son, someone who's born into the family, someone by right to be there, might share that right, might say to the slave, "Y'all come. You're welcome to be as family with us." This morning I'd like to explore a story from American history. We do this every July, don't we? A story that I hope will illustrate the trap, the lie that some of Jesus' listeners have fallen for, and which I sometimes become mired in if I'm not very, very careful. It's the trap, it's the lie of sin and worthiness. This idea that some folks are inextricably stuck in their sin, whereas some folks, like me, are worthy. And in so doing, I'd like you to imagine the last time you rode in an airplane, and how when you took off from Bluegrass Field or wherever it was that you flew out of, how your view changed. Sorry, I probably should have given, to those of you who don't travel well, I should have come up with another image. But bear with me, assuming it wasn't terrifying for you the last time that you flew, how the image changed as you gained elevation. And in particular, as you approached the airport where you were going to land and you looked out the window, or heard other people telling you what it looked like when they looked out the window, perhaps you remember the difference between a view at 10,000 feet and the view as you were making your final descent. And so to start with, I'd like to tell this story with the view from 10,000 feet, and in a moment we'll zoom in as we land. So the view from 10,000 feet is that this story comes from late 17th century Boston. So hear that as about 100 years before the American Revolution. And in Boston, there was this attempt by the King of England to consolidate power. Did you know that about 150 years before the Revolution, there was an attempt for some of the colonies to work together? And when word of this got back to England, England was very upset about it. And so about 100 years before the Revolution, the king said, "I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to dissolve all of your governmental structures. I'm going to fire all of your governors and all of your assemblies, and I'm going to appoint a governor over New York, New Jersey, and the New England colonies, and I'm going to call it the Dominion of New England." The The governor, appointed by the king to rule over this consolidated dominion of New England, was a gentleman named Sir Edmund Andros. And it didn't go well. The view from 10,000 feet is Andros and the people that he was trying to govern did not get along, and he became increasingly upset toward them until finally on Good Friday of 1687, with all of the threat of force that he could muster, Governor Andros required that Old South Church in Boston hold an Anglican service by order of the king's government. As clear a violation of religious liberty as you and I will ever come across in American history, even in the colonial era. But that's the view from 10,000 feet. Come with me a little bit closer to the ground at a slow, leisurely, safe descent. And let's take another look from closer to ground level. Some observations on this story as we lower the plane. The first observation I would make about this story is just how quickly the oppressed became the oppressor. Just how quickly the oppressed became the oppressor. The people that Andros was sent to govern were, by and large, Puritans. We sang about them a moment ago. Why did the Puritans come to this place, these colonies, this place called America? Religious freedom and various other freedoms. That's right. They came here to be free. They realized that if they stayed in the places where they had been living, they would not be able to worship freely or live according to conscience without bumping into the governmental structures around them. And so they sought permission to leave, or they just left. The Puritans came here for freedom of religion, but almost immediately, already in the 17th century, already in the mid-1600s, they were using that freedom to start restricting the freedom of others. In this case, the Anglican Church, the Puritan majority in certain areas, started to restrict the state religion, the official religion of the colony, the Anglican Church, from worshiping and following Christ according to their own conscience. And so when Governor Andros was appointed, he never stood a chance as an Anglican representative of an Anglican government. The people who were there in Boston remembered mistakes that he had made as a headstrong young governor in New York colony some decades earlier. And so when he came back to the colonies, he was met with almost total contempt. For example, the new government that was set up, though it had dissolved all of these other structures and in that respect was terribly offensive, it did still contain an assembly. The colonies within the Dominion of New England had certain numbers of representatives, and every so often they were to come to Boston and they were to meet with Governor Andros. If there were something like 80 seats in the assembly, they seldom had more than about 7 people show. And imagine the embarrassment of Andros sitting in a very nice, opulent chair, ready to assemble the assembly, with crickets chirping in the corners and all the seats empty before him. We think that the gotcha politics of the last 24 years is new. It has precedent, going back a long, long time. You disrespect me, I'll doubly disrespect you. And as we venture through this story, I'll just spoil the ending for you. It won't end well. First observation is how quickly the oppressed become the oppressors. Second observation, the quickest way to turn a bully into an all-out tyrant is to show constant disrespect. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that Governor Andros was headstrong and made all sorts of mistakes as a leader, as a young person. I can relate to that. But there was a long memory among the Puritans, and there was no forgiveness and no second chance. As a result, Governor Andros grew increasingly embarrassed and increasingly exasperated, until finally in the Lenten season of 1687, he was looking for a way to celebrate Holy Week. We observe Holy Week. We participate with sister churches across the community. We gather for Wednesday night services and Maundy Thursday services and Good Friday services. Many of you have gathered in this room or at the college chapel or in sister worship settings of sister churches. And Andros was looking for an opportunity to do the same. He wanted to do this in his own way. He was looking for an Anglican service. Didn't want to have to participate in a Puritan service, since that wasn't his background. And in fact, he had seen the Anglican Church, his own background, suppressed, even though it was the official church of the state. Now hear that. What a different sort of twist that is. That the Puritans who had left England to seek religious freedom were using that freedom to limit the faith expression of others. Repeatedly, Andros reached out to the local church, Old South Meeting House in Boston, those of you that have toured Boston. Again and again and again he asked, couldn't we do Holy Week? Couldn't there be some time set aside in this edifice, in this structure, for an Anglican service? Those of you who stood a moment ago in a military background, you probably recall a chaplain turning around a room for a Protestant service and then a Catholic service and then perhaps a Jewish service, turning that room around, getting it ready. And Andros, in much the same way, was asking, couldn't we have an Anglican gathering during Holy Week, which I get it that you do not observe as Puritans, but we as Anglicans do. Again and again and again, he made this request. No answer. And so finally, the Wednesday of Holy Week, 1687, he sent a representative to the leaders of Old South Meeting House and asked them, demanded of them, give me the keys. I'm the governor. Ignore me, mock me, so be it. I'd like the keys. Now the Puritans wanted to talk. They found a delegation and sent it off to the governor's mansion to go meet with the governor to talk about all the reasons why they could not in good conscience hand over the keys. That was Maundy Thursday. Good Friday, Andros was tired of talking. Went around the delegation, went around the go-between, and went directly to the sexton of the church and said, ring the bell. Call the people to worship. Call the people to an Anglican-style service in this house of worship. And again, whether the view is from 10,000 feet or boots on the ground, it's not a good moment in the history of religious freedom. It's an outcome that no one could feel good about. Whatever moment of satisfaction Andros may have felt, if there was any, as he went to Old South Church and worshiped there, it didn't last. His wife would arrive in the colonies a few months later and die the following winter. Most folks think it was for spite that he held her funeral in the Old South Church with an Anglican liturgy observed that day. And things were not going well with the government back in England that had set up the puppet government in New England. And by that fall, what was known as the Glorious Revolution had overthrown King James II. In the following spring, the news reached Boston that the king had fallen several months before. And a mob went to the governor's mansion and took Andros and his officials and imprisoned them for a year before shipping them back to England. Whatever momentary satisfaction there may have been for Andros had passed. And clearly, what came was an outcome that in hindsight, nobody can feel good about. Third, in general, both sides of a religious liberty debate have sincerely held religious beliefs. We can hear, we know from middle school civics class what was compelling the Puritans. Their sincerely held religious convictions. We can also hear the echo of the same in Governor Andros. Whatever his shortcomings might have been, whatever his issues may have been, here was a man who also was Anglican, baptized into the Anglican Church, confirmed in the Anglican Church, and wanted to worship in the Anglican tradition at least during the high holy days of Holy Week and Easter. He wanted to worship in his own way, which happened to be the state religion. The Puritans wanted to worship in their own way, which happened not to be the state religion, but was the religion of the majority in their particular area. We can hear the tension. We can hear the inevitability of the tension. It's going to come to the surface at some point. And this is what's profoundly different about the American experiment. In our nation's heritage and identity, it is just this tension that is built into our foundational documents. It is literally written into the parchment of our people. It is in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first part of that is known as the Establishment Clause. The second part of it is known as the Free Exercise Clause. Terry, if you'll leave that up there for a minute, you can see the tension built in. Because a law that is enacted by the state might keep one group from free expression. And the free expression of one group might run counter to the best interests of the greater good. This is, for example, why our understanding of religious freedom as Americans is so different from the understanding of religious liberty that you might find in Paris, France. Because in France, they're not nearly as interested in the idea of free exercise. This is why if you keep up with any of the major European news outlets, they're always talking about whether or not someone's cross was too large or too ornate, or whether or not someone's burqa was too long. It's the idea that they have, very different from our own, that some freedom is too much. And they're much more worried about that freedom inconveniencing someone else. Whereas in the American version, in the United States version of religious freedom, we say, you know what? Exercise freely. Wear your cross. Cover your head. That's between you and the Almighty. This is what makes the United States approach unique, is that by its very nature, because the tension is written into the Constitution, we have to keep working it out. Religious liberty cases will continue to come before our courts. We will continue to need to be informed about them. And if we're to learn anything from history, we need to recognize that in most of these cases, there is a sincere religious conviction on both sides of the debate. Humbly, respectfully, we keep working it out because we want folks to be able to exercise their faith freely without having to encumber it with legislation. We want to be able to have helpful legislation that doesn't coerce a particular type of faith. And why is that so important? because it follows what you and I believe about our God. Jesus himself does not coerce. Jesus himself does not demand. Jesus himself does not require that we swear an oath of allegiance. Look at the story Jesus told to his listeners in John chapter 8. It's a lot more like a family. It's a lot more like a household. The Son declares you free, and you are free, but you can keep on living like a slave if that's what you choose. Jesus does not coerce. See, you and I, GBC in the 21st century, we would disagree sharply with Old South Church. That was giving Governor Andros all he wanted and then some. We would disagree with how they came into being. They were only 18 years old at the time, and they came about as a church split from First Church. Third Church came about as a split off of First Church. And the reason that they split was over the issue of infant baptism. And now you and I are very respectful of the various starting points and various faith backgrounds of the folks that we interact with, whether they join this church or not. We simply believe that an individual at a certain age, as they enter into maturity, has to stand before the Almighty and choose. This is why we take the lid off of this square structure over here and baptize people in the water. When they themselves become believers, we observe believers' baptism. So while it's wonderful that we stand up here and we say as a church, and parents say, and guardians say, we intend to introduce this little one to Jesus, we intend to raise her up in such a way that she would come to know Jesus in a life-giving relationship, it is not that we do not go to the waters of baptism until that individual can say, I believe. I choose. For myself. It's my faith. Now, let's go to the waters of baptism. See, our agreement or lack thereof with Old South Church or anybody else is not the point, and it is not the test. Agreement is not the prerequisite. The Baptist Joint Committee says it this way: an attack on anyone's religious liberty is an attack on everyone's religious liberty. Let me say that again, and boy, let's let it sink in. An attack on anyone's religious liberty is an attack on everyone's religious liberty. When the majority requires the minority to capitulate, or in the case of some nations that are run by dictators or even regions that are dominated by a henchman, when a minority violently bends the majority to its will, these are the moments that illustrate how passionately we need to be informed and advocating for our own religious liberty. Because the religious liberty of others and full expression of it is a natural byproduct of a healthy American democracy. Ultimately, the working out of our definition aside, or the competing definitions of religious liberty aside, let us hear again the good news that lies beneath the story Jesus tells to those religious leaders in John chapter 8. If the Son sets you free, if the Son says, you who have always been a slave and think of yourself as a slave today and would be a slave tomorrow if we let you, you are part of the family, then you're part of the family. If the Son has set you free, then you'll be free indeed. And that's why you and I know some Americans who do not know Jesus and are mired in the chains of bondage. And it's why the persecuted church around the world is freer than the unsaved man blaring Bruce Springsteen while shooting fireworks off his red, white, and blue yacht. this morning, the Son, the Holy One, declares it yet again. You are free. You are family. The choice is ours, whether to live into that freedom. So our invitation this morning is a call to conscience. It's a call to choice. Do you want to be part of the family or not? Do you want to live embracing freedom, or do you choose to remain in slavery? This morning, if you realize that now's the moment for you to come into the family of God and recognize that the Lord has made you worthy to receive Jesus as Savior and as Lord, if that's your decision, then won't you come forward as we sing this next song? Or if you recognize that these sisters and brothers have become your family of faith and you need to enter more formally into partnership with us, we would love to celebrate with you. Or if there are other ways today that you need to mark within your spirit the difference that Jesus is making, however it is that you need to respond to the work of the Holy Spirit in your life, we stand and we sing in hopes that you'll come.